Jack the Stripper, Part 1. Disturbing serial killer Jack the Stripper, who strangled 8 women in West London and has never been found. Serial killer bore chilling similarities with his Victorian namesake, including brutal mutilation of victims' bodies. Welcome to Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's true crime podcast. A podcast where we delve into some of the world's most perplexing mysteries, unsolved crimes, and haunting cold cases. Join us this week as we look into the terrifying details of the serial killer known as Jack the Stripper, who terrorized London throughout the early 1960s. One of the most disturbing serial killer cases to occur in London, a man murdered 8 sex workers over a 5-year period from 1959 to 1965 and dumped their bodies across West London. The killer, nicknamed Jack the Stripper, would target his victims at night and strangle them to death, with several of his victims also missing their front teeth. All the victims were sex workers, all were small of stature, and all showing no signs of struggle. The local press began calling the uncaught killer Jack the Stripper, an ode to Jack the Ripper, who had terrorized London sex workers about 75 years prior. After the death of his 3rd victim, Scotland Yard came to the realization that a murderer was on the loose. Due to the lack of forensic evidence available, one of the only clues came from flecks of paint left on his victims' bodies, which suggested that he worked on an industrial site. Up next, hunt on for a maniac sex killer. Hunt on for maniac sex killer. Swinging London woke up on April 24th, 1964, to the fact that a depraved serial killer was stalking its streets. The body of Helen Bartholomew, 22, had been found naked in an alley. She was the 2nd victim discovered that month and the 3rd since February. Newspapers had speculated one man was behind the prostitute's murder, but no one was in any doubt now. The Daily Mirror's front page headline was, "Giant Hunt for Maniac Sex Killer." Detective Chief Superintendent John DeRose, who headed the inquiry, said at the time, the story of the man who became known as Jack the Stripper is certain to have as prominent a place in the annals of time as that of Jack the Ripper. Known as 4-Day Johnny for his speed in solving cases, Mr. DeRose added, "There are hundreds of police involved in this inquiry, more than any inquiry ever before. We'll get him. You can be sure of that." Yet they never did. How did the murderer evade the massive investigation? Up next, the victims. The victims. Elizabeth Figg. Dumped in scrubland with her dress torn at the waist, the horrific details of Elizabeth Figg's murder were hard to stomach. Believed to be the first victim of the serial killer, Elizabeth Figg was found dead at 5:10 a.m. in June 1959 by police officers on a routine patrol. Her body was discovered in scrubland west of Barnes Bridge, an area known as a lover's lane that was frequently used by prostitutes. Her dress being torn at the waist, and open to reveal her breasts. Her shoes, underwear, and personal belongings were missing, and the marks around her neck were consistent with strangulation. A pathologist concluded that death had occurred between midnight and 2 a.m. on June 17, 1959. A post-mortem photograph of Figg's face distributed to the press was independently recognized by her roommate and her mother. Extensive searches of the area, including the riverbed, failed to find Figg's underwear, black stiletto shoes, or white handbag. Police official theorized that a client had murdered her in his car after removing her shoes and underwear, and that these and her handbag then remained in the car after the body was disposed of at Duke's Meadows. A pub owner on the opposite side of the river said that on the night of the murder, he and his wife had seen a car's headlights in the area and heard a woman scream. Gwyneth Reese. The 22-year-old's body was discovered November 8th at the Barnesborough Council refuse disposal site, the Mort Lake. Dump was only located 40 yards from the Thames towpath just 1 mile away from where Elizabeth's body had been found 4 years previously. She was naked except for a single stocking in her right leg, and her cause of death remains unknown. Several of her teeth were missing in what was to become a gruesome calling card of the serial killer. First, the two brutal killings were not linked, but it is now believed both women were the first two victims of Jack the Stripper. Hannah Telford, known as the first official victim. 30-year-old Hannah Telford was found dead on February 2nd, 1964, below the clubhouse of the London Corinthian Sailing Club by Hammersmith Bridge. The mum and two had been strangled to death, while several of her teeth were missing, and her underwear being stuffed into her mouth. She left her young daughter with her partner at their flat in West Norwood, South London, on the night she was last seen, January 24th. It was noted that there were many physical similarities between her and the two earlier possible victims, although at first the police believed her death to be a possible suicide. But police did not believe a serial killer was at large until Irene Lockwood's murder in April of that year. Irene Lockwood. Just 2 months later, on April 8th, the body of Irene Lockwood was found on the foreshore of the Thames in Chiswick. The 25-year-old pregnant woman was found naked and face down in the river, the postmortem quickly revealing that she'd been strangled. She was last seen in the Windmill Pub, Chiswick High Road, the night before her death. It was at this point that police officers began to suspect that a serial killer was on the loose. A huge manhunt was launched as women grew terrified of walking the streets of London alone. This fear was compounded even more, and just 2 weeks after Irene was killed, Helen Bartholomew was found dead. Helen Bartholomew. 3 weeks later, officers made another gruesome discovery in an alleyway in Brentford. Like other victims, 22-year-old Helen Bartholomew was missing her front teeth, being strangled to death on April 24th. Helen's murder gave investigators their first solid piece of evidence after flecks of paint used in car manufacturing were found at the scene. Police believed that the paint had probably come from the killer's workplace and began to concentrate their efforts to tracing it to a business nearby. Mary Fleming. Scottish-born Mary Fleming was found on July 14th outside an address in Chiswick. Similar paint spots were again found on the body. She'd also been strangled, and her front teeth were missing. Witnesses told police that they recalled hearing a car reversing down the street shortly before her body was discovered. Frances Brown, also known as Margaret McGowan, amongst other names. 21-year-old Frances Brown was last seen alive by a colleague on October 23, 1964. She was seen getting into a client's car before her strangled body was found in a car park in Kensington a month later. She and fellow prostitute Beryl Mahood had been picked up by two motorists near Portobello Road. Beryl gave police descriptions of the motorists. Before her death, she'd been working as a sex worker with a more exclusive clientele, including businessmen and politicians. She testified with Christine Keeler and Mandy Rice Davis at Stephen Ward's trial during the infamous Profumo scandal. Her colleague was able to provide police with an identikit picture and description of the car, which is thought to be a grade Ford Zephyr. Bridget O'Hara. Bridget O'Hara, 27, meanwhile, been drinking in Shepherd's Bush Hotel before strolling off with an unidentified man. Irish immigrant Bridget O'Hara was found dead on February 16, 1965, near a storage shed on the Heron Industrial Estate in Acton. She'd been missing since January 11th. As it being similar with previous cases, the body showed signs of industrial paint, which are traced to an electrical transformer near the place she was discovered. An examination of her body also showed signs that she'd been stored in a warm environment, with the transformer believed to be a good fit for both the paint and the heating. Not the end of the story. This is far from the end of the story. Despite the mounting body count and one of the most extensive investigations in Scotland Yard's history, Jack the Stripper's identity remains a shadowy enigma. A notorious gangster, convicted killer, and other suspects have all come under the magnifying glass, but none fit the puzzle completely. 60 years later, the chilling truth remains locked in history, a grim echo of Jack the Ripper, unsolved reign of terror. Who was Jack the Stripper? How did he evade justice? And could the clues left behind finally lead us to answers? Join us next week as we delve into the tangled web of investigations, explore the suspects, and cover the theories that keep this case alive in the darkest corners of true crime lore. If you enjoyed this episode of Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's True Crime Podcast, don't forget to hit subscribe and leave us a review wherever you listen. Till next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, the past never truly stays buried.